we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:10 or 9:11 p.m. here in this very, very dismal part of Central Europe, a very dark, depressing, cold day in Budapest. It's very, I use the term day very loosely because here it's so dark almost all of the time that day and night become almost interchangeable. There's just a kind of constant grayness that turns into blackness at some point during the day, and you barely notice it. So that's by way of introduction, and welcome to the Gaggle live stream. And really appreciate everybody who has joined me. And just before we started, the Department of Justice, the Inspector General, has published his report about January the 6th. I mean, it's a long report, so I really haven't had a chance to read it very carefully. I just glance through it. And the interesting thing is, as predicted, that the media have already gone with the story. That's it. The conspiracy theorists have been refuted, have been humiliated. There's no truth to any of the conspiracy theories that there was any FBI involvement in the events of January the 6th, 2021. This is very similar to the previous Inspector General report. If you recall, there was the Inspector General report about the origins of Russiagate. That came out, I think, December 2019. Also, the Inspector General was Michael Horowitz. And again, the media ran, that's it. All the conspiracy theories have been refuted. There was ample evidence that there was a basis for opening the Russiagate investigation, and no one at the FBI did anything at all wrong other than conscientiously investigate all of the leads about the connections between Donald Trump and the Russians. But of course, that's not what the Inspector General report said. In fact, the Inspector General report was quite devastating about the FBI and the ridiculous basis on which they launched their Russia collusion investigation and persisted with that investigation, and refusing to look at any contrary evidence. And worst of all, they manufactured evidence. They manufactured evidence in order to justify the FISA warrants. So if you recall, the application for a FISA warrant against Carter Page was based almost entirely on the Steele dossier, that ridiculous nonsense, which was just simply based on opposition research and was just laughable. But along with that Steele dossier that they cited, they also cited the FBI, that is, an article in Yahoo, but the article in Yahoo was itself based on the Steele dossier. So what they were doing by citing this article in Yahoo in their FISA warrant was suggesting that there were two alternative sources of evidence, but in fact, the second piece of evidence was simply parasitically dependent upon the first piece of evidence. And of course, they didn't mention the fact that the Steele dossier was itself based on opposition research, and so it was based on the Hillary Clinton campaign. And so that was withheld from the FISA judges. And then, of course, more seriously, it turned out that um, there was a fabrication of documents in order to present Carter Page as not having worked as an informant for the CIA, whereas in fact he had worked as an informant for the CIA. But in their FISA application, they denied that he had worked on the CIA, knowing that he had. So those were very serious issues were raised in that Inspector General report, and that's why Peter Strzok was soon fired from the FBI. Well, you're getting something similar here, and I want to just read something out from this because, as I said, the key is that they're asserting that there was no FBI involvement in the January the 6th. So here is the part in which is I think relevant here in the case of uh, the report. If I can find it, which of course I can't. Nope, that's good because I can't find it. Well, that's interesting. Let's see. Is this it? Okay, let's see. I hope everyone can see it. But anyway, if you can't see it, I'll just read it out. And here's what the Inspector General said. We found no evidence in the materials we reviewed or the testimony we received showing or suggesting that the FBI had undercover employees in the various protest crowd or at the Capitol on January the 6th. So, of course, that's the sentence that the media are running with. Oh, great, that's it. No evidence in the materials we reviewed or the testimony we received showing or suggesting that the FBI had undercover employees in the various protest crowd. But then he goes on. We reviewed the documented CHS. So CHS is confidential human source reporting. So we reviewed the documented confidential human source reporting that the FBI had prior to the riot and breach of the Capitol on January the 6th. We determined that 3 confidential human sources had been tasked by the FBI field officers in the days leading up to the January the 6th electoral certification with the required approval of the WFO. Not sure what that is, but that list it explains somewhere what WFO was. To travel to DC for the events of January the 6th to report on domestic terrorism subjects who were possibly attending the event. Okay, so that means the FBI had pretty good inkling of what was going to happen, or what could happen, but unlike what Christopher Wray had insisted in his testimony. So specifically, one FBI field office tasked a confidential human source to travel to DC to report on the activities of a predicated domestic terrorism subject who was separately planning to travel to DC for the January 6th electoral certification. A second FBI field office tasked a confidential human source to travel to DC to potentially report on 2 domestic terrorism subjects from another FBI field office who were planning to travel to DC for the events of January the 6th. And the third confidential human source who had informed their handling agent that they intended to travel to DC on their own initiative for the events of January the 6th, was similarly tasked by their field office to potentially report on 2 domestic terrorism subjects from other FBI field officers who were planning to travel to DC. Then our review concluded that none of these 3 FBI confidential human sources were authorized to enter the Capitol or a restricted area or to otherwise break the law on January the 6th. Nor was any confidential human source directed by the FBI to encourage others to commit illegal acts. Okay? Then he goes on. In addition to these 3 confidential human sources, we found that 23 other FBI confidential human sources were in DC on January the 6th in connection with the events planned for January the 6th. So now we have 23 other FBI confidential human sources were in DC on January the 6th. And then it says, none of these FBI confidential human sources were authorized to enter the Capitol or a restricted area or to otherwise break the law on January the 6th. Nor was any confidential human source directed by the FBI to encourage others to commit illegal acts on January the 6th. Okay? We determined that of the 26 confidential human sources who were in DC on January the 6th, in connection with the events of January the 6th, 4 entered the Capitol. Okay? 4 of these 26 entered the Capitol during the riot. An additional 13 entered the restricted area around the Capitol, which was a security perimeter established in preparation for the January 6th electoral certification, and 9 neither entered a restricted area nor entered the Capitol or otherwise engaged in illegal activities. None of the confidential human sources who entered the Capitol or a restricted area has been prosecuted to date. So that's 17 who either entered the Capitol or the restricted area. None of them has been prosecuted, even though pretty much everybody who has entered the Capitol or the restricted area has been prosecuted. And then again, the WFO did not know that a total of 26 confidential human sources would be in DC for the events of January the 6th, because only 4 field officers had informed the WFO or the FBI headquarters that confidential human sources under the relevant field officer jurisdiction, 5 confidential human sources in total, would be traveling to DC on January the 6th. So they clearly, what they're doing here is dumping on the confidential human sources. Well, yeah, but they weren't FBI employees. Well, nobody said that there were specifically people who were FBI employees who were involved in January the 6th, just like in the case of Ray Epps. I don't think anyone said, oh, Ray Epps, oh yeah, he was an FBI employee. No one, that wasn't really the argument, but confidential human source means that you're in some way, you are working for the FBI. I mean, you're not you're not on the FBI employee list. But that's quite an extensive FBI involvement documented here about January the 6th. So what they're doing is doing the usual legalistic argument, saying, oh, well, there weren't FBI employees, as if everyone has said. Well, no one has said that FBI employees broke into the Capitol on January the 6th. Confidential human source, yeah, that's enough. Means essentially they were working for the FBI. So the media again doing the thing, oh, that's it, the conspiracy theories have been beaten over the head once again. But in fact, that's not what happened. So just as with the case of the first Michael Horowitz report in 2019, there's a great deal of extremely damaging information about the Justice Department. So that's the report. Now, the other interesting development over the past couple of days, we can talk about Syria later, but this is Ukraine. That Ukraine has once again launched an ATACMS attack deep inside Russia. So something like 6 ATACMS missiles were launched in the Rostov region, and this Russians, of course, say, "Oh, didn't do any real damage." But of course, the Russians have laid down a red line, if one can call it that, saying that we regard these ATACMS, which are long-distance missile attacks deep inside Russian territory, these attacks ostensibly by Ukrainians, but really these are attacks by NATO, because Ukraine is not able to use these missiles. They're not able to use the satellite technology. They're not able to to project the trajectory of the missile. How to avoid anti missile defenses and so on. These are NATO attacks on Russian territory, and so in that case, not only does the possible use of nuclear weapons could be warranted, because that's exactly what this, according to the new Russian updated nuclear weapons doctrine, which says that nuclear weapons are warranted in the event of a conventional attack, which is aided and abetted, a conventional attack by a non-nuclear power, which is aided and abetted by nuclear powers. So that would obviously qualify in this case. And since Putin had specifically said these ATACMS were basically declarations that NATO is at war with Russia, and then in particular, when he delivered his address last time that Ukraine had launched these attacks inside Russia, he had said that henceforth we reserve to ourselves the right to attack those NATO countries that are assisting Ukrainian attacks on us. In other words, you attack us with ATACMS, and we reserve the right to hit military installations in NATO countries, in those NATO countries that had helped, armed, and facilitated Ukraine's attacks on us. So we had the previous ATACMS attack, and then we had the Oreshnik, which was this new Wunderwaffen, which was an intermediate range missile that can carry conventional warheads, it can carry nuclear warheads, and it has the multiple independent re-entry vehicles, which means that each missile can carry many warheads, and so it's be quite difficult to stop those missiles. So that was the Oreshnik. And then after the attack by the Oreshnik, Ukraine launched another ATACMS. So there was the Russian response with the Oreshnik. There was on Dnipropetrovsk, and then there was the Putin. That same day, Putin delivered this national televised address, and Ukraine's response was to launch another ATACMS attack, clearly indicating that no one was intimidated by the Wunderwaffen. Then there was nothing really after that. There was nothing really much that happened. So day after day went by, and there were no more ATACMS attacks. And then I think we talked about this last time, where Moon of Alabama, one of our favorite sites, Moon of Alabama, wrote a whole item. We'll call it a blog, saying, "Whoa, you notice, Moon of Alabama writes, you notice there haven't been any ATACMS attacks for a while. I think," this is Moon of Alabama speaking, "I think NATO's got the message. they are now sufficiently intimidated by the Oreshnik, and they've decided to call off any more attacks. Now, and when we talked about it last time, it was always a very dubious argument, because for the obvious reason, well, what happens if tomorrow Ukraine does launch an attacks? You've made this argument that there haven't been for a few days any more attacks, and you've drawn the conclusion from this that that's because NATO is so intimidated by the Oreshnik, and that they've told Ukraine to knock it off. And so, well, that's a convenient explanation, very self-serving explanation. But even if it hadn't been for the Oreshnik, and there was a hiatus after the first Oreshnik, after the first attacks, and they were saying, okay, no, there's no more. They would have said, oh yeah. The reason why there haven't been any more attacks is that they don't have anything in the cupboard. That's it. They're gone. They're run out. They've run out. The United States has run out of ATACMS. The British have run out of Storm Shadows. And the French have run out of Scalp missiles. That's why there haven't been any more. We're just run out. The cupboard is bare. But because of the Oreshnik, because of there was this Oreshnik attack on Dnipropetrovsk, they came up with a new argument. Oh, the reason why we haven't been any more attacks is that the West is absolutely petrified of the Oreshnik. So now there has been another attack by ATACMS, and in the Rostov region, not in Kursk, where supposedly was all going to be in Kursk. It's going to be limited. We're going to limit it in Kursk. So now it's in Rostov region, and the Russians have obviously said that they will respond. And the Americans have announced that we expect another Oreshnik attack on Ukraine. That's what the U.S. Defense Department said. We expect another Oreshnik attack on Ukraine. Well, that's very interesting. I mean, because it means first of all, obviously Putin is absolutely right. Ukraine cannot use these ATACMS by itself. I mean, it simply doesn't have the capability. It doesn't have the satellite technology to be able to do it. It's just you have to have either the British or the Americans or the French who are guiding these missiles, as indeed they are with the drones. I mean, the Ukrainians are firing these drones deep inside Russia. They're hitting oil refineries. They're hitting air bases. Ukraine cannot do those. Cannot target the drones also without NATO assistance. But nonetheless, Putin drew the line at ATACMS. Now, if you look at the Americans and say, okay, we expect another Oreshnik attack on Ukraine. Well, the first thing we can conclude from that is that if Putin was seeking to intimidate NATO, and particularly the United States, that he has singularly failed to do so, because it's already been 26. So no, this is it's been more than 2 weeks. But it's been about 2 weeks. Maybe is it 9? No, it's been 3 weeks. It's 3 weeks since the Oreshnik attack. So it hasn't intimidated the Americans. They've gone ahead and still supported and obviously encouraged and then facilitated attacks on deep inside Russia. So the Oreshnik, well, no Oreshnik, that hasn't stopped the Americans. But the other thing that we can conclude is that the Americans do not believe that Putin has any intention of using the Oreshnik on any NATO territory. That's why they said, no, we expect him to use the Oreshnik on Ukraine. So despite the fact that Putin made this nationally televised address saying that we now regard the military facilities in NATO countries, those NATO countries that are assisting Ukraine, arming and assisting Ukraine, and we regard those military installations as legitimate targets, and thus obviously suggesting that he could well use Oreshniks on NATO territories. But Americans are not taking it seriously. They're just saying, nah, he's just going to use it on Ukraine. Well, one can gather from that this whole thing of attempting to intimidate Ukraine and attempting to intimidate NATO really isn't working. I mean, unless you actually do something, unless you actually attack NATO territory, then no one's going to take you seriously. And it doesn't have to be nuclear weapons. You don't need to use nuclear weapons to get your message across. But you do have to indicate that you are ready to hit NATO territory. And Putin has clearly said he's not going to do it. And the Americans have made, are clearly convinced that the Russians are not going to do this. Then the Russians are not going to target NATO territory. And that's it. That's pretty much it. I mean, it's like, therefore, Russia can go on issuing these threats, drawing red lines, and so on. But if no one takes it seriously, then that's it. I mean, you haven't really achieved your goals. And the Oreshnik has clearly not achieved its goal. Now, it achieved its goals in the sense that you've got the whole ZAnon crowd who got very excited by the Oreshnik, as they always get excited by whatever Russia does. It's always very, very exciting. And it's a game changer. We're told it's a game changer. One thing, it hasn't changed any game. The strange thing is they were saying it was a game changer, even though Russia had given 30 minutes notice before they launched the Oreshnik. So in other words, to make sure that everything possible could be got out of the way. And again, that was inside Ukraine. But then afterwards, after the Putin nationally televised address, Gerasimov had initiated. Gerasimov is the, I guess he's the Russian kind of head of the armed forces, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He initiated a call to the U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, a man called Brown. And so it was the Russians who had initiated that call. Now, if you initiate a call after you made this threat about the Oreshnik, then you would have to say you say you're telling the Americans, don't get too upset about it. Don't get too excited, right? I mean, it wasn't the Americans. It wasn't Brown who initiated the call to Gerasimov. It was Gerasimov who initiated the call to Brown. And so that would already indicate that that they wanted the Americans to cool things down, to be reassured that nothing untoward was likely to happen. And I think that's true. And I think that is where we are now. So the Oreshnik has not had that effect on any kind of deterrent effect on NATO, as it was fairly obvious that it wouldn't. And we talked about it a great deal here. It wouldn't, for the obvious reason that no one doubts that Russia has lots and lots of very lethal weapons. It doesn't need any additional weapons. It already has short-range nuclear missiles, medium-range nuclear missiles, long-distance nuclear missiles, even without even the nuclear component. Russia has a lot of weaponry. That no one's ever denied that. But Russia hasn't really done anything with that, nothing effective. I mean, it hasn't knocked out the bridges over the Dnieper River, which would have been at least of some strategic significance. Russia hasn't knocked out Ukraine's power infrastructure. I mean, again, Russia obviously has the capability to doing so, just completely knock everything out. Russia hasn't done it. So if you haven't done any of those much more basic things, then no one's going to be very impressed that you've come up with some new Wunderwaffe. And I think that's always been the problem. Now, how will Russia respond to this new ATACMS attack? It might not do anything. I mean, it might again, launch some fairly pointless attacks on these on Ukrainian electricity infrastructure. It's done that plenty of times. It doesn't have had much of an effect. It might even unleash the Oreshnik, but hasn't. But doubt whether it's going to have much of an effect either. So, if you do these kinds of things, and then you can't really expect the Americans or the British or the French to be particularly intimidated. And so it's it really is a fairly pointless exercise, other than to get these kind of the Xenon crowd in the West, and it's always in the West, to write all these very excited blogs, where it's Moon of Alabama, or all the people who come on Andrew Napolitano's show. This is this is really a game changer, the Oreshnik. But they always say everything's always a game changer. Everything's always a this is it. Just like they were telling us, it has been forgotten about how those NATO generals, Russia killed, I don't know, 50 NATO generals or whatever it was. So that was another game changer, but never happened. So now the other thing is, of course, is the Syria issue, which has clearly undermined international confidence in, to say the least, in Russia, for the obvious reason that much of Russia's enormous reputation, current Russia's enormous reputation, comes about from Putin's intervention, apparently decisive intervention in 2015 to save Bashar al-Assad. He stepped in. He didn't wait for the Americans, and he just let fly, and Assad survived. Now, that was of course 2015, and there have been many years have gone by since then, and it was fairly obvious as the years went by that this was a very hollow Pyrrhic victory, because Bashar al-Assad really wasn't in any way the president of Syria. He controlled a certain part of Syria, but the Americans controlled another part of Syria, and the Turks controlled another part of Syria, and the Israelis controlled another part of Syria. And yeah, so clearly, and because Russia had very limited leverage over the United States, it had some leverage over Turkey, but it chose not to use that leverage. Instead, Russia preferred to. And my eye caught Marty. Marty's always got a really good suggestion. Film club topic suggestion: terrorist attack incident. Well, that's a very interesting topic. There have been a number of films about that. I like you. Yeah, it's good that you've gone back a little bit, because I mean, I think there've been a number since 9/11. I'm sure there've been a number of films. I don't really want to do, too many of those 9/11 films, but you've gone back to Black Sunday, which, I mean, that was from the 1970s. I think it was John Frankenheimer who directed that. But that was, of course, the villainous Palestinians. That was in the heyday of the Palestinian terrorism, which not even the heyday. It's fairly ubiquitous in Hollywood. But that's a good suggestion for the film club about terrorism. But again, we'd have to be careful about picking which films, because I really don't want to do any of these, 9/11 and intrepid American heroes, cracking terrorist codes. Anyway, going back to the Syria. So Putin's reputation is largely based on, I mean, obviously Crimea. He moved decisively in Crimea in 2014, and then Syria in 2015. And so, particularly the Syria project added to his reputation, because then it seemed like he was ready to use force to challenge U.S. global hegemony. They came in, the Americans were obviously determined to topple Assad, who was obviously seen as by the Americans. He wasn't, but he was seen as a stooge for Iran. And of course, he's a longtime ally of first the Soviet Union, then of Russia. And he gave the Russians a warm water port. They got a nice port in the Mediterranean, and they have a big air base also out there. So clearly, Americans wanted Assad out, and Putin thwarted their plans. So he became kind of a global hero. Hey, the Americans wanted to do this, and you stood up. You went in. You decisively sent in your forces. You saved Assad from the Americans. The Americans were ready to do to Assad what they did to Saddam Hussein and what they did to Muammar Gaddafi. And so he has acquired a huge reputation. But that's 2015. As the years went by, and Assad's obvious weakness, the fact that he was unable to consolidate his power in Syria, and that other forces were growing in strength in Syria, obviously growing in strength in Idlib, but also the Kurds under U.S. protection were growing in strength. They were helping themselves to Syria's oil and wheat fields. That clearly was it was a matter of time before Bashar al-Assad would be toppled. And then Putin made the cardinal mistake of launching one war when you haven't finished your previous war. I mean, that was Hitler's major blunder in World War II was you're starting one war when you haven't finished this war, and that becomes a real problem for you down the road. And that was obviously the case. here in Syria. So the um, the Washington Post, David Ignatius, he has this article today, and Ignatius, I mean, I don't believe him. Maybe he's being spoon-fed stuff by the CIA. He always has. But he says here, there, and others have said this, others have confirmed this, is nothing new, that Ukraine had given substantial assistance to HTS in Idlib. They provided drones and they provided technicians for the drones to HTS. And he says also that Ukraine had also given assistance to rebels in Mali because they wanted the Mali to inflict pain on the Wagner group, which was helping the government in Mali. And I think they did inflict pain on Wagner. I think a number of Wagner mercenaries were killed. Now, if this is true, and I think again, there's a lot of many sources of information. Now, I don't believe Ukraine is making these decisions by itself. I think, when you say Ukraine did this and Ukraine did that, these people, Zelensky and the people around him, they're not that smart. They're not that powerful. And so obviously it's the Americans who are using Ukraine. But it shows ingenuity. I mean, this is what you do when you fight a war. You open another front. You open a second front, and a third front. So we now had, really in the last few months, Ukraine opened up a front in Kursk, which was supposed to last about 4 hours, but it's basically already lasted 4 months. They opened another front in Syria, which has inflicted a great deal of damage to Russia's reputation. And then they opened on a front in Africa against the Wagner group. So again, I mean, I don't. I want Ukraine to lose this war. I mean, there's no question. But I want Americans to lose this war. However, you'd have to say that's how you fight a war. You open up fronts. Instead of just going, in this one dimension, you try to use your imagination. Go where somebody is vulnerable. Hit them where, behind the lines when they weren't expecting an attack. And clearly, I think the Americans and Erdogan, doubtless, they saw that Russia was vulnerable in Syria. They said, well, why don't we launch this attack in Syria? See how the Russians respond. And then it turned out the Russians failed to respond. Probably because they're so tied up in Ukraine. I think they didn't have anything with which to respond. And, so there's an article today in the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, which publishes some quite interesting stuff. But they said that Assad had turned to the Russians and said that, okay, I might not be able to hold on to Damascus, but why can't I just create a little statelet in Latakia, which is really where the Alawites are. That's his base of support, the Alawites in Latakia. And that's, of course, where Russia has its naval base and its air base. So, why don't I just leave Damascus and set up a state in Latakia? In other words, due to the Americans, and the American clients, what they did to us, which is we create a statelet in the west of the country, and then again that would prevent the rebels and the American clients from consolidating their position in Syria, and therefore, we will fight another day. But apparently, according to the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, the Russians turned down this plan. And they gave him asylum, but they turned down this plan. which could have given, in theory, it could have given the Americans some headaches. Now, I don't know whether that was how feasible that was. Whether you can create in Latakia some kind of a state that could be run by Assad. Might have been worth a try, because this is his home base. This is where the Alawites are based. And presumably, I mean, if he had done that, maybe that would have added some fighting spirit to the Syrian armed forces, that they were going to hold on at least to a piece of Syria, from which later on they can mount offensives. But no, the Russians said, no, we're not going to do it. So that's that. So Assad, they gave Assad asylum. Okay, so we'll probably never hear from him again. And the Russian, from what one can gather, the Russians have already abandoned the naval base. I mean, they say, oh, the ships have are on some kind of maneuvers in the Mediterranean. I'm not buying it. The air base, apparently there's still aircraft in the Russian air base. They haven't come under attack, but it seems almost impossible, that basically that the HTS or the Americans or the Turks are going to allow the Russians to hold on to their air base. So I think that's gone. And the Americans, they want that base. They want the Tartus naval base. So they want that. It's an important part of the Eastern Mediterranean. There's Americans want to maintain their control over the Eastern Mediterranean. It's a very, very useful. Absolutely, Americans are going to take Tartus base over, refurbish it, and it'll become a major U.S. naval base. So that's that. And yeah, but the Russians will just move their aircraft. They'll move them out. I don't know how many military personnel Russians have currently in Syria, but I would imagine they're going to be moving them out, flying them out at a fairly crisp pace within the next couple of weeks. So that's a real blow to Russia's reputation, and we've got Trump coming in what was it, just a little more than a month, and we know the way Trump thinks, and we can even gather from those tweets or truths that he sent out over the weekend that he sees Russia as a loser. I mean, he was being generous. He was being condescendingly generous, but obviously that's he said. Hey, you got your clock cleaned in Syria. Not to worry. I mean, no one likes Syria anyway. He says, yeah, don't worry about it. But he can take note of it. I mean, he may send out tweet, oh, don't get involved in Syria. He said, don't get involved. But he always does that. He always makes this claim that he's an America first, a non-interventionist. He just wants to pack up and go home. He did that throughout his first term. He's not going to do that. If you tell him, hey, this Tartus naval base in the Eastern Mediterranean, this is going to be really big for us. And you know what? We'll change the name. Instead of Tartus, we'll call it the Trump naval base. How do you like that? Ooh, I like that. The Trump naval base. Yeah, the Trump naval base in Syria. And you took it over from the Russians. Well, how do that's nice. Trump naval base. I like the sound of that. That's what's going to happen. United States is not going to withdraw from Syria under Trump. And as I said before, I don't think that the the peace plan that he's going to offer, that he and Kellogg are going to offer, will be particularly um, generous to the Russians. Anyway, let's take a look at some of the comments from the Gagglers. We go to our Gaggle page, and you see these are the people who, these are the Gagglers who keep the dogs um, in being. They prevent the dogs from just tearing me apart. Those Chihuahuas. They're small, but they're fierce, and they're so displeased with me, so that that anything at all that can calm them down just for a few days is very, very most appreciated by me. Anyway, so we have a first comment on our locals page from Ivan Grozny. I like Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible. Anyway, he says, George, I hope you're well. Thank you. I know you have talked about it a bit lately, but I'm curious what you think the special military operation is right now. I kind of find it unlikely that the Russians would settle for the current line of ceasefire, but I could see a world where Zelensky stays and the non-Russian claimed part of Ukraine becomes a part of NATO. What do you think the current stage of negotiation is or is likely to be? Well, that's an excellent question, and I, if you say what's the current state of play, I am assuming that Putin and Shoigu and Gerasimov are figuring that or Trump is going to be in office really in a little more than a month. He will, pretty swiftly after taking the oath of office, send Kellogg on a peace mission. Kellogg will come to Moscow. Kellogg will obviously go to Kiev. Maybe Kellogg will even go to Beijing with this plan. And the plan is basically freeze the conflict, put the NATO membership issue on the back burner. Just say, okay, we'll come back to it. Whatever. I mean, Trump can't say, well, we'll postpone it for 25 years because Trump's not going to be in a position to commit any future president. He can say, while I'm president, Ukraine will not be a member of NATO. That's the easy part. However, he will promise Kiev that he will continue to send lots and lots of arms to Ukraine, and that those bilateral treaties that Ukraine has signed with the United States, with Great Britain, with France, they're going to be valid. So although you're not a member of NATO, you still have all these bilateral security treaties with the most powerful member states of NATO. Now, since the Russians know that this is coming, I am assuming that they are trying to grab as much land as they can, so that when Trump does present this plan to freeze the conflict in place, they'll say, "Hey, yeah, well, we've done okay. We've got, I don't know, by that time, maybe 70% of Donetsk will be in Russian hands. I think 98% of Lugansk will be in Russian hands. Maybe about 70% of Kherson, 70% of Zaporozhye will be in Russian hands. Maybe that's I think what they're counting on. And then they say, okay, well, we'll freeze the conflict in place, and that's not a bad deal. Or at least I think it's a lousy deal. I think it's a terrible deal. But at least Putin we'll be able to sell it. They say, well, we've accomplished something. We've got more territory now in Ukraine than we had prior to the launch of the special military operation. Now, the problem here, of course, is an obvious one, which is, well, how is this different from Syria? Because you're freezing the conflict, and we know how the United States operates, how NATO operates. They're just going to bide their time, and they're going to certainly wait out till Putin's gone, and then they'll attack again. And then, really, who knows what kind of a leadership will emerge after Putin. Now, obviously, most observers say, oh, well, whoever comes after Putin will be kind of a ferocious nationalist, and he'll want to build up Russia's military and plot Russia's revenge. Well, that's possible, but you never really know. I mean, Russians are kind of unpredictable. Most people had assumed after the death of Stalin that whoever comes after Stalin will be somebody very like Stalin, a ferocious hawk, and very anti-Western Cold Warrior. And indeed, in the early days of Khrushchev did sound ferocious. It turned out that he kind of began to pursue a policy of détente. I mean, the détente policy came unstuck under Khrushchev for the obvious reason that the West has never been interested in proper, respectful relations with Soviet Union or with Russia. And Khrushchev, I think, found that out painfully in 1960. I think that was when the Americans launched their U-2 spy flights, and even though they'd said that they wouldn't have any U-2 spy flights. Anyway, and then again, during the 1970s, we all assumed that when Brezhnev dies, whoever takes over from Brezhnev will be somebody like Brezhnev with a little more energy. He'll be younger, more energetic, more imaginative. But we had somebody in the leadership that tossed everything into the waste paper basket, into the trash bin. Everything that the Soviets had fought for, they lost millions of men. Millions, liberating Eastern Europe, providing the Soviet Union with a set of buffer states, a set of satellite states, if you like. The Soviets had made great sacrifices, and it was all just tossed away by Gorbachev. They took a chunk of Germany and said, that's it. We're going to prevent Germany from ever again threatening us. So we're going to help ourselves to a big slice of Germany. All that was just tossed away. Now, I don't know whether what's going to happen after Putin, but it may well be that the new leadership will emerge, not a very nationalist leadership, but the leadership will say, look, we tried it. We tried to take on the West. We did our best, and we just couldn't do it. We just didn't have any. We didn't have any allies to challenge Western hegemony. We talk a good game about multipolarity and how got a new currency to challenge the dollar and all the rest. We talked a good game, but basically no one came on the pitch to fight on our behalf. So why should we just go on in this way? Suffering, sanctions, wars, and so on. So that could happen after Putin. I find it hard to believe that Putin will survive for much longer. I have a feeling that these are the last days of Putin. Now, obviously, the question then is who's going to take over from him. But I do think that this is really the twilight of the Putin era, um, and uh, and so. But in terms of what happens now in the special military operation, I think the plan will be freeze the conflict in place. I think Russia will accept this. The question, I think, much more important is will Ukraine and will the whole big military, political, media establishment accept a freeze on the conflict? And I think that's a really difficult one, because I think that Trump will be in a minority in Washington if he presented this plan of essentially freezing it in place, allowing Russia to keep a big chunk of territory, and then saying no to NATO membership, at least for the time being. It's going to be a hard sell for Trump, and so in that case, even if Russia has accepted, and then Ukraine doesn't accept, and then and then the military and the political establishment also say no, we can't accept this, then basically the war goes on, and then I think Trump will escalate American involvement, and then I think it gets very, very tricky for Russia. I think then Russia really will have to make some very serious decisions, because now I think this would be a major American escalation under Trump. Um, I don't think the outlook is very good. I think a lot of people have a lot of expectations from Trump, but I think they'll be disappointed. Whatever Trump's own predilections may be, I mean, I think he probably does want to end this war, and he may well think that, look, let's just freeze the conflict freeze everything at the moment. We'll get an armistice, and then we'll just postpone making any real decisions for a number of years. He may think that that's not a bad deal for everyone. Everyone walks away with something, and at least you don't have war. I think Trump, instinctively doesn't like war, but I just don't think he's going to be able to pull this off. I think there'll be just such opposition within the Republican Party, let alone among the Democrats, because this is the whole Ukraine project is a Democrat project. But within the Republican Party, there'll be such outrage at the idea of ceding any territory to Russia, and such outrage over postponing Ukraine's NATO membership for a number of years, that Trump will just have to back down. Anyway, that's that's how I see it. So we'll see. But I think that the Russians are really in a waiting mode. They're waiting for Trump. Anyway, Stone River, thank you very much. Very generous of you. Says, invasion of the drones here on the east coast of the USA. Where's Chris Christie when you need him? Yes, it's very interesting. You got these drones flying over New Jersey, and I haven't been able to figure out what's really going on. I mean, who's sending these drones, and why are the drones in New Jersey? I haven't quite figured this out, but but yeah, where's Chris Christie? Well, Chris Christie was never anywhere when you needed him, and now with Chris Wray resigning. Chris Wray got that job because Chris Christie had recommended him. I mean, Trump didn't know who the hell he was, but Chris Christie told him, "Oh yeah, he's a great guy," and Trump hired him. So that's a Chris Christie accomplishment that has now been tossed aside. Ray was always an absolutely terrible choice, and Trump should have got rid of him. But during his first term, but I guess he felt very vulnerable. I mean, he'd fired Comey, which of course had triggered the first impeachment, and then, or at least it didn't. I mean, it sort of did. I mean, because when he fired Comey, um, that led to the hiring of Mueller, and Mueller obviously had one goal in mind, and that was to get Trump impeached. So that was the only thing that the whole Mueller investigation was always a fraud, because Mueller knew from the start that there was nothing to Russia collusion, but they kept the investigation going in order to trap Trump people into perjury, and of course to build a case for obstruction of justice. That was that somehow Trump was guilty of obstruction of justice. But of course, so that just kept that going for that purpose. But in terms of these drones, I mean, you tell me, you tell us what the hell's that's about. I mean, I can't quite figure it out. But thank you, Stone River, for generosity. And Cynthia, always very good to see you, Cynthia. And again, as I said on Tuesday during our live stream, everybody needs to go to the Gaggle screening on our locals page. We're screening A Clockwork Orange. And even before you watch the movie, read Cynthia's many comments and observations and insights, because that's that's essential reading to get the best out of the movie experience. So anyway, thank you, Cynthia. So Cynthia says, you said the West will likely hire jihadists in Syria to conduct terrorist attacks on Iran, Russia, and even China. I said that, yes. But isn't it equally likely these countries will also hire jihadists to conduct terrorist attacks on the West and its Middle East allies? And since Israel and Turkey border Syria, they'll be most vulnerable to these attacks. I suppose it won't happen right away, but a bit later on it will. Doesn't the West understand that by hiring terrorists to do their dirty work is self-destructive in the end? Well, so, it's a very, very interesting question. The strange thing is that Russia and China don't do this. They don't hire jihadists to unleash against the West. They simply don't do it. The Americans do it. The Israelis do it. But the Russians don't. Russia goes through this whole routine of being too good for this world. That it's just too moral. For international affairs. So they don't do what states have done in the past. I mean, there's nothing so unusual in states using terrorism to get what they want. I mean, it's they obviously presidents or leaders of states maintain plausible deniability, but nonetheless, there's nothing so unusual about hiring terrorists to make life difficult for your purported adversaries. But Russia and China don't do this. And the fact was that the Bin Laden and that gang, the Mujahideen, in Afghanistan, they all came under the control of the Americans. And the Americans unleashed them, particularly after the Cold War. They unleashed them in Russia, and unleashed them in Central Asia, and unleashed them against China. So they acquired all this experience in Afghanistan, fighting against the Soviets, and now they can be used for American foreign policy ends. And of course, they were very active in the Balkans against the Serbs. And they did in the Balkans what they've been very good at in the Middle East, which is to inspire terror among their opponents. Now, of course, they're not much good at fighting, but they terrify their opponents, because they not only do they slice people's heads off, they film themselves slicing people's heads off, and then they put these sliced heads on display, and everyone is absolutely petrified of these terrorist groups. And that's the whole purpose. It's not that they're a particularly effective fighting force. It's more of a psychological effect that they have. Now, you're saying it's a very short term, and of course, it was short term. I mean, in other words, it's self-destructive. You didn't say short term. It's self-destructive, and clearly, the Bin Laden and the people around them, Bin Laden or the Mujahideen, they turned against their paymasters. I mean, then they did that. They started attacking American targets in 2000, and then obviously 9/11. But there was even before that they attacked targets in the Middle East, and that is definitely a problem with hiring these jihadis. You can't always control them. Most of the time you can. Most of the time the jihadis were giving problems, giving headaches to America's would-be adversaries. I mean, they were absolutely destructive in the Russian Central Asia during the 90s, in Chechnya and Dagestan. I mean, it was a really terrible war that they unleashed, and the Americans were perfectly happy with that. And they did the same thing in China, in the Xinjiang province, where there was a substantial Muslim population. So, yeah, but there's always you can't always control them. I think that if the only thing you can't do, I mean, with these terrorists is, I mean, I don't think the Americans are even all that upset if there are terrorist attacks in Europe, because it just makes the Europeans even more subordinate to the Americans. That's never the problem. The only thing that becomes a problem for the United States if they start committing terrorist acts against Americans. That's an embarrassment. But otherwise, that's fine. Just unleash them. So you've got to, it obviously it is a problem, I think, for Turkey, and yeah, I mean, it's clearly with Erdogan, it is short-term thinking, and he has had serious terrorist issues, but he tends to blame that on the Kurds. That's his response, even though it's the jihadis that he has supported who are behind this. But invariably, any terrorist incidents in Turkey, he attributes to the Kurds. But I think the main target obviously will be Russia, and again, China, but of course in Iran as well. And Iran has very limited abilities to fight back. I mean, it's just Iran is a very divided country. It's very, very disparate peoples. And it may be that the clock has run out for the Islamist revolution, that they won't be able to sustain this for much longer if they are subjected to an all-out onslaught, an all-out, the maximum pressure campaign. And all the indications are that that's what Trump is planning on. And that means it's at every level. I mean, Trump is obviously going to unleash Americans' energy production. So when oil and gas, so what's the effect of that? Well, that's going to lower energy prices in the world. So that countries that depend on oil exports, such as Iran, And Russia, well, they're obviously going to be hurt by this, and that's part of the Trump plan. So that's good. But in addition to that, I think there will be the terrorist attacks in against Iran. Um, then there will probably be some kind of a quote democracy unquote movement inside Iran. Women taking off their hijabs and everything. Protests in Tehran, well, clearly supported and aided and abetted by the West. And then, terrorism is a two-edged sword. You can unleash the terrorists against Iran, and then you can purport to be the fireman putting out the fire. So then you can start bombing targets in Iran because, hey, ISIS is rearing its ugly head. We have to bomb targets in Iran in order to attack ISIS. So I kind of see Iran really as a kind of a multi-pronged attack coming in the the next 2 years. But in terms of it's very short-sighted. It is and it isn't. You can make because if it does come back and hurts the Americans or hurts the Turks, hurts the Europeans, then you can always unleash another global war on terror. So, like during the 90s, the Americans were in bed with the jihadis, clearly in the Balkans and clearly in Russian Central Asia. They were clearly in bed with them. I mean, obviously they were allies, just like when Jake Sullivan said Al Qaeda is our ally in Syria. These were clearly allies. Because Russia, and this was Boris Yeltsin, who was supposedly loved by the Americans. They were struggling inside Chechnya. They were unable to defeat this insurgency in Chechnya. So it was giving Russians headaches, and then I was giving the Serbs headaches in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Kosovo. And so, but then when it kind of blew up in the Americans' face, hey, what do? You launch a global war on terror and pretend to be shocked and upset and distressed about, hey, a lot of jihadis are running around and they don't like Western civilization, so we have to go fight the jihadis. Of course, they don't fight the jihadis. That was always a front, because they went and fought the people who were against the jihadis. They went and overthrew Saddam Hussein, who was fighting the jihadis, just like they overthrew Muammar Gaddafi, who was fighting against the jihadis. And of course, and they killed Soleimani, who was fighting against the jihadis. So clearly, it's a fraud. So when you say it's a two-edged sword, yeah, whichever way it goes with the jihadis, it works in favor of the Americans. You unleash it against your adversaries, and then if it blows up in your face, then you launch another global war on terror. But anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you for your generosity as always. And then Vic Shakapopoulos. Vic Shakapopoulos. Thank you, Vic Shakapopoulos. Dear George, in your opinion, why doesn't Russia embrace the anti-Zionist cause as the USSR did during the Cold War? What are the upsides of maintaining good relationships with Israel for Russia? Because I can hardly see any. Does Putin think that he can sway Israeli politics using the post-Soviet diaspora? Or is he just trying not to pick too many enemies? What could be the case? Maybe I'm missing something. I think it's an excellent question, and it's one that doesn't really have any obvious answers. If we go back to the Soviet era, the Soviet Union had not been particularly Zionist during the 1920s and 1930s. Keep in mind, the Soviet Union had created its own Jewish national homeland, Birobidzhan, that the Jews didn't really want to go to. But nonetheless, they did create this Jewish national homeland, which preceded the state of Israel. But anyway, they didn't really embrace the Zionist cause until well into World War II, and then suddenly the Soviet Union became the great champion of Zionism, and and was the first state in the world to officially recognize the state of Israel. Um, it's never been very clear why Stalin suddenly took this position initially. Now, maybe he thought that the state of Israel will be quite pro-Soviet because, of course, many of the Jews in that early state of Israel had origins in from Russia, had fled the Russian Empire, and that they hated the Russian Empire, they hated the Tsars, and that they would therefore be sympathetic to the Bolsheviks. So maybe he thought that the state of Israel would be quite hostile to the West, particularly the British. There was no love lost between the Jews in Palestine and the British Mandatory Authority. And maybe he thought, they're socialists. In the early days, they had all that kibbutzim nonsense. They thought, okay, their natural kind of sympathy towards the Soviet Union and socialism would prevail. But that didn't happen. And when Golda Meir, she was appointed Israel's first ambassador to the Soviet Union. So I think in 1948, when she visited, didn't visit, she came to take up her post as Israel's ambassador to the Soviet Union. All these the Soviet Jews, they greeted her like a like a goddess, like a mother goddess. Huge demonstrations in Moscow to greet her. And now when you do something like that, this absolutely infuriated Stalin. Thought that the Jews were being very, very ungrateful. He was already quite sick of the Jews in any way, but particularly the Jews had been very powerful within the Communist Party. He had removed some of their influence, but there was still obviously considerable influence of the Jews among the communists. And then Stalin really turned against them. Stalin turned against Israel, and particularly when Israel essentially invited the Jews of the Soviet Union to leave the Soviet Union and come to Israel. Well, you can't really do that, and so that was that just enraged Stalin, and so relations really deteriorated seriously from that moment on between the Soviet Union, and then the Soviet Union kind of discovered the Arabs and thought that Arab nationalism would be a more likely bet for them, and so they kind of embraced Arab nationalism. But it didn't come naturally. I mean, it came really after Nasser really kind of had a falling out with his American patrons. So the Americans had installed Nasser into power in Egypt. They wanted to use Nasser against the British. Basically the British ran Egypt, but they wanted to use Nasser, who hated the British, and turn him into kind of an American asset, which was fine. And Nasser was ready to do that, but he really didn't like Israel. And that was a really a sticking point. And then when Nasser sealed a kind of an arms deal with Czechoslovakia, well, obviously communist Czechoslovakia, the Americans turned around and punished Nasser by withholding funding from the Aswan Dam. And so they withheld the funding from the Aswan Dam, and then Khrushchev turned around and said, okay, we will take over the funding of the Aswan Dam. We'll take over from the Americans. And that really, started the whole, the Soviet presence in the the Middle East after that. But it was always difficult because Nasser was just, he was using the Soviet Union, and he imprisoned the communists, and there was a limit to how much influence the Soviets would have in Egypt. But nonetheless, the Israel issue was rankled, and then when war broke out in '67, the Soviet Union was quite actively helping Egypt and just generally the Arab side. And then that was the Soviet Union then broke off diplomatic relations with Israel in '67, and didn't restore diplomatic relations until 1991. I think 1991 they restored diplomats. So that was 24 years that they had no diplomatic relations. And the Soviet Union really led the anti-Zionist cause at the United Nations. The whole Zionism is racism, that General Assembly resolution, it wouldn't have passed had the Soviets not really thrown their weight behind it. So that was they really mobilized the kind of world opinion against the Zionist cause. And they kind of generated really the international consensus on behalf of the two-state solution. I mean, it really was the Soviets who made sure that became a kind of global consensus, which though the West, or at least in the United States, was strongly opposed to that. But even the Europeans kind of had to go along with it. But that was all thanks to the Soviets. So then so to go back then to Putin, he himself has spoken very warmly about the Jews and about his own experience with the Jews after World War II, and his family in Leningrad during World War II, the warm relations they had with the Jews. So there is a strong kind of philo-Semitic quality to Putin, and he has, consistently pursued a very friendly, positive relationship with Israel. Now, it's true that he's maintained reasonably good relations with the Arabs, but fundamentally, that relationship with Israel prevents Russia from ever really pursuing in any way or pushing in any way for some kind of a definitive resolution of the question of Israel and the Palestinians. So it's become completely meaningless. Because whenever you listen to Zaharova, she talks about, we have to go back to the quartet. Now, the quartet, nobody even knows what the hell the quartet is. But it was somehow cobbled together. I think it was in the George W. Bush era, that under the auspices of the quartet, there would be some negotiations towards the two-state solution. The quartet that comprises, I think, the United States, Russia, the European Union, and the United Nations. I think those are the four members of the quartet. But that's all, of course, long been forgotten. But the fact is that Russia has not pushed in any way for a solution to the Palestinian problem. And I think it was very striking during the years in which Russia had so invested in Bashar al-Assad, that essentially Russia continued to take a blind refuse to notice, refuse to acknowledge the continual daily, nightly bombing of Syria by Israel. And Russia's position was, well, this is a fight between Israel and Iran, and we really aren't taking any position on that. It was a very strange view to take, but that was Russia's view. So they made no attempt to stop Israel from bombing Syria. They never provided Syria with adequate air defense system. They certainly never got the S-400. I'm not even sure whether they have the S-300, but they didn't have anything really that with which to stop the Israeli attacks. The Russians did have the S-400 at their air base to defend their air base and to defend their naval base, but the Syrians never had the S-400. So in other words, basically they left Syria at the mercy of Israel, and of course that took its toll eventually on Syria's armed forces, year after year of getting hammered, and Damascus airport continually getting hammered. Now, to go back to your question, I mean, so why don't they go back? Why don't they return to it? Well, I don't know. I mean, Putin seems to want to have good relations with everyone without really pursuing any consistent line of action. So he has this good relations with Israel. He wants to also have good relations with the Arabs, and he has reasonable relations with the Palestinian Authority, and I think he even had reasonable relations with Hamas. I'm not at all sure what that gets you if you have good relations with everyone if you're not really pursuing any distinctive agenda. I dare say Putin will say, well, all these sanctions that have been imposed on us, Israel has never joined any of the sanctions. And Israel has only given minimal, if any, support to Ukraine. So we've achieved something. I don't think it's much of an achievement, given that Russia is supposed to be a great power, but that he'll say, okay, well, at least Israel is not among our adversary states. But to go back to your question, Vic Shakapopoulos, what does Russia get out of maintaining good relations with Israel? I don't see it, to be honest. I really don't. Russia isn't really in any way a part of the peace process, because there really isn't a peace process. I mean, there was back in the 70s, there was a peace process, and the Soviet Union was a part of that. And then, the Madrid conference in 1991, which really gave rise to the whole Oslo process. Again, the Soviet Union was one of the sponsors. The Soviet Union and the United States were the sponsors of the 1991 Madrid conference. But there's no conference now. So, as I said, Sharapova, not Sharapova, what's the name? Zaharova, Maria Zaharova. She can talk all she likes about the quartet, but there is no process being generated by the quartet, and therefore the only game in town when it comes to the Middle East is the United States, because only the United States has any leverage over Israel, and of course the United States doesn't exercise any leverage over Israel. But what does Israel do for anyone? I mean, Israel doesn't do much for the United States. I've never believed any of those arguments that somehow Israel is some key strategic asset for the United States. It's not a strategic asset at all. Israel pursues its own agenda. It never pursues any of America's goals. It never has. So therefore, it's just it's just a fantasy. I mean, I think people like Noam Chomsky have written that somehow Israel is a vital part of the American global empire. That it plays a crucial role. It doesn't play any role at all. It's an entirely kind of emotional, fictional alliance, and some of that goes to Putin and Russia as well. I think, as I said, Putin has spoken many times about his own personal fondness for Jews. From his early days in Leningrad, what his family told him about the Jews in Leningrad, um, and he's spoken a lot about that. He has spoken. He's claimed that Israel is essentially, part of the Russian civilization because there's so many Russian speakers in Israel that he kind of regards Israel as an offshoot of Russia. That's since he cares so much about Russian civilization, he said, well, there's so many Russians there that it's one of us. So again, it's very much an emotional appeal, not in any way any rational, not based on any kind of rational calculation. So it's different from American, but it's also, in case of the United States, also it's an emotional issue, nothing to do with any strategic advantage. And of course, in Russia, as in the United States, you have a very powerful Israel lobby, a lot of very wealthy Jews who exercise quite a lot of influence within Russia. And I think Putin does listen to them as well. And the Vic asked me, any luck with the subtitles problems? Have you tested the solutions I posted on the locals feed? I haven't yet, but I will. I'll try and do it over the weekend. But I saw that, but it's I haven't had a chance to do that. So thank you for providing me with that information. I don't know if I'm going to succeed. I'm not technologically the most sophisticated person, but I'll do my best. But anyway, thank you so much for providing that information. Marty, it was always very good to see you. Thank you for your generosity. And then, we have the thermal limp handshake. So let's look at Marty as this firm. We have Macron and Macron and Trump. This is the. It's very odd. When they met the other day, they went through this whole very, very firm handshake routine. Obviously, it was highly exaggerated, but I don't think Trump is much of a handshake person. He is a germaphobe, and so he's never been a real handshake sort of guy. And of course, Macron himself is a somewhat, limp of wrist. But I think that's why they went through that exaggerated handshake. But Trump just doesn't like handshakes, and that's why Angela Merkel, in her new book, says about how Trump really didn't want to shake her hand. I think he just tends to avoid handshakes. So it's it's very strange that Trump kind of conveys this manliness, this sort of masculinity, and he plays on this. He's the kind of regular guy, but a regular guy really isn't a germaphobe. I mean, a regular guy is someone who just, I don't know, doesn't care much about germs, and then he doesn't drink, which itself is also not. You think a regular guy is someone who kind of knocks back whiskeys with the best of them, but he absolutely doesn't touch alcohol. So he's a strange kind of man's man. Anyway, Going back to Marty's point about Black Sunday, I read the book but never watched the film. I haven't read the book. I watched the film a long time ago, and I seem to remember it was quite good, quite exciting. Um, but that's a good idea about the we'll look into the terrorist attacks and cinema. See if we can put together some interesting film. I mean, it'd be good to go back to some of the previous, if there are films from a previous eras about terrorism. I remember, I mean, Joseph Conrad he wrote that great novel Under Russian Eyes about anarchist groups. And but I don't know whether there was it Under Russian Eyes? No, it's under Western Eyes. So that was always kind of interesting that in past eras there was concern about terrorist groups, violence, anarchists. So I have to see how many films have been made of that, because otherwise it's boring, constantly having films about jihadists, Palestinians, and so on. Be kind of interesting. Terrorists before the jihadi era. Thank you for the suggestion, Anne Marie. Good to see you. Thank you very much for your generosity. The oh God, I'm trying to think what was the last thing that we did, with the music club. I was kind of interested when I was just wondering, Anne Marie, what you thought of that piece of music by Ravel, the Pavan for a Dead Princess. And I'd be interested what you thought of it. It's a kind of short piece of music, which I thought was kind of one of the saddest pieces of music ever written. So I'd be curious to know what you thought. But anyway, thank you so much, Anne Marie, for your generosity. Steve Brown says, "Oh no, Iran, Russia, and China have historically not hired terrorists like the failed, former, and totally disgraced, debauched, perverse, and inherently corrupt Western collective historically has." I agree, and I think that was what I was saying earlier. That for some reason they don't do it. It's like they talk about Soleimani as somehow he supported terrorism, but in fact he didn't. He really didn't. I mean, he obviously wasn't happy about Americans establishing themselves in Iraq next door, particularly when they'd already established themselves on Iran's eastern border in Afghanistan. So, as any patriotic Iranian, I mean, he's quite concerned about being surrounded by Americans. But even people who know something about what went on in Iraq say the evidence that Americans were being killed in Iraq at the behest of Soleimani and the Iranians, the evidence for that is really very thin. So it's not at all clear, even though it might seem rational, that Soleimani would want to kill Americans in Iraq and would facilitate terrorist incidents against Americans to try to get the Americans out of Iraq. I mean, that's what an Iranian general would want to do. A patriotic Iranian general would want to get the Americans out of there because he sees the Americans as being a threat to Iran. And so, yeah, you would say, well, that's why he sponsored terrorist incidents in Iraq, killing Americans. But from what I've read, he really didn't even do that. That this is just simply a kind of a fiction that the Americans have built up, that somehow Soleimani was responsible for the deaths of Americans in Iraq. He really didn't do that. He should have done it, but I don't think he did. So again, you have the alternative in this multipolar world. The alternative pole doesn't seem to fight. I mean, it doesn't seem to want to fight. They want to show themselves to be too good for this world. Well, we respect international law. No, it's only worth respecting international law if everyone respects it. I mean, but if the others who are stronger than you are don't respect international law, then don't do it. So Anyway, Cynthia says the U.S. got its cock keened in Afghanistan. Shouldn't that also count as an utterly humiliating defeat as well? Well, that's a very good. I mean, you're. That's an interesting question. I don't think I wouldn't put it like that. Um, that it's utterly humiliating defeat because the United States did achieve something in Afghanistan. First of all, they did push Al Qaeda out. From what one can gather, the Taliban are not sponsoring Al Qaeda at the moment. I mean, that may change, but at the moment, I haven't seen evidence suggesting that the Taliban is back to its old ways of sponsoring Al Qaeda. Also, they did drive out bin Laden from Afghanistan and eventually killed bin Laden. So that wasn't wholly a failure. And the other thing is that I don't think America invested politically that much in Afghanistan. I mean, it was almost completely off the news pages. I mean, hardly anyone even knew that America was still in Afghanistan. So it's a kind of it's a colonial war. You know, you're occupying another country. You're trying to run another country, but you haven't invested that colonial project with the same intensity as previous colonial project, namely, let's say the French in Algeria. That was a very serious emotional investment in Algeria. I mean, they made Algeria essentially a part of France, but de Gaulle finally cut Algeria off. And again, the Americans were heavily invested in Vietnam, and that was also a colonial project, but eventually they abandoned it. Each of those cases, abandoning Algeria and abandoning Vietnam, I think was counted far more than abandoning Afghanistan. Now, that's why you can give up on something like Afghanistan. Yeah, you wasted a lot of money, but America has money to burn. That doesn't matter. You've lost a number of Americans who got killed. That counts for something. But again, America's a big country and can afford to lose, I think, 5,000 servicemen at most who were killed in Afghanistan. So you can afford to lose that. But in the case of Russia, obviously, Ukraine is not a colonial project. Ukraine is a civilizational struggle, so that's a very big deal, whether Russia prevails there or not. Syria was also a big deal for Russia because it had invested so much. This goes all the way back to 1971 and the signing of that friendship treaty between Syria and the Soviet Union. It goes back even further. It goes back to the era of Imperial Russia, when Russia was the protector of the Eastern Christians. That was what that was the big Russian project in the 19th century, protecting the Eastern Christians from the Turk. And so it's a very long-standing commitment that has now been abandoned. So that in addition, obviously, to the loss of prestige, in addition, I think, to the loss of its naval and air base, which hasn't, not yet, but I think they will lose that. So, and then, if the jihadis are unleashed, then I think this will be a big, a big kind of problem. If they start having to fight Muslim terrorism in Russia, something that's it's an ongoing thing, but can really be unleashed very seriously against Russia. But also there was the Putin project, the project that he has outlined. He outlined obviously when he got involved in Syria, but he's also outlined it ever since then. This is the project of multipolarity, or basically challenging U.S. hegemony. So Syria was really a part of that project of challenging the United States. This is, here we are, we don't have U.S. hegemony anymore. We're building a multipolar world. Look, we saved Bashar al-Assad. The Americans wanted him out. We saved him. And now the Americans got their way. So it's very hard to see anything that um, America Russia has achieved in Syria, because at least in Afghanistan, you say, yeah, well, we went in, out of a rage because of 9/11. I mean, we had to punch somebody, and Afghanistan was the first first person that we could punch. So, but it wasn't being used as a kind of to transform the global order in the way that Putin wanted to use Syria to transform the global order. So, I mean, it's a very interesting question you raise. Isn't that a humiliating defeat? And I don't know. I mean, I kind of think that it's not quite the same. I think the Syria is a worse setback for Russia than Afghanistan was for the United States. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And where are we at? Yes. Sorry, but go back. Yes. So Steve Roundgo says the perversity of Western thinking is fully on display with Trump inviting Xi to Trump's inauguration after threatening massive tariffs on China. It's amazing how Americans fail to grasp anything with regard to diplomacy. What idiots Americans are, not exceptions. I see what you mean. On the other hand, I have to say, I just found this very funny. I mean, it's just, I mean, to invite. I mean, it's not even a thing, heads of state coming to the inauguration of American presidents. They've never really done that. I mean, they obviously they have representation at the inauguration. You can have ambassadors. You can even send your foreign minister. But to invite Xi to do it, it's Trump having fun. I mean, it's his kind of sense of humor. He obviously doesn't think Xi is going to accept the invitation. I don't think Xi is going to accept, but it's possible that he's going to send, maybe a foreign minister, maybe somebody at a reasonably senior level to the inauguration. But I think it's just Trump having fun. Because I mean, that's who he is. So, but I can't see Xi getting there, and I don't think Macron's going to show up. I don't think Keir Starmer's going to show up. So I just think it's funny. I mean, it's like that's the good part of Trump. He's always entertaining. He's always going to do something that's hilarious. And as you say, he threatens these tariffs, and then he says, "Yeah, but Xi's a good friend of mine. So why don't you come and attend my inauguration?" And then Vic Shakapopoulos says, apropos of the issue of terrorists and Iran, Russia, and China, he says, well, they kind of have during the Cold War, the various anti-colonial movements employed what we would today describe as terrorist tactics. I prefer to call that guerrilla warfare because I consider their cause noble, but it's a thin line. I agree with you. I think the Soviets did involve themselves. I mean, it's always hard to know to what extent they did that. But I mean, like the African National Congress, they did engage in what was regarded as a terrorist act in South Africa. I mean, the United States regarded the ANC as a terrorist organization, and of course, the ANC was strongly supported by the Soviet Union, so that was an example. But a lot of things were terrorist acts during the Cold War were attributed to the Soviet Union that I don't think the Soviet Union really had anything to do with. I mean, in Britain, which was very preoccupied, obviously, with the fight against the IRA, starting in the early 1970s, and there was constant accusations that the Soviet Union was backing the IRA. I don't think the Soviet Union had anything to do with the IRA. I think that was all basically coming from the Americans. So, all these crazy Irish Americans were providing funding for the IRA. I don't think the Soviet Union got much involved in that. So who else was doing terrorism? Well, of course, the PLO for a while was engaged in terrorism, and probably the Soviets had provided some assistance, but it's hard to know whether it was that significant because back in the day, the PLO had a lot of backers in the Arab world. So I think Hafez Assad was probably a more significant contributor to PLO terrorism than the Soviets were. But I take your point that the Soviet Union, was probably involved in some way with terrorist incidents. What was counted at the time as terrorism. As I say, PLO was counted as a terrorist organization by the United States, by many Europeans. ANC counted as a terrorist organization, and they were again supported by the Soviet Union. However, Russia, the contemporary Russia, the post-1991 Russia, does like to posture as too good for this world. We're just we're just too moral. We just don't do things like that. We don't interfere in other countries' internal affairs. I mean, how many times does Putin say that? We don't interfere in other countries' internal affairs. And again, you say, well, why don't you? I mean, that's what you're supposed to do. Oh, we respect the sovereignty. Yeah, I mean, why? I mean, it's the people you're up against. They interfere all the time in the internal affairs of other countries, including the internal affairs of Russia. But no, we don't interfere in internal affairs. We're absolutely against terrorism. And of course, after the 9/11 attacks, Putin immediately offered his help to George W. Bush in the global war against terror, and allowed Russian territory to be used to transport American forces into Afghanistan. So, yeah, that's the post 1991 Russia isn't really the Cold War of the Soviet Union. Anyway. Steve Brown says the important thing is to roll back the U.S., NATO, Israel terrorist momentum that has been advancing for decades. I agree. Yeah, absolutely. And as Steve goes on, I think if you look at the killing of the healthcare CEO and the reaction, it shows how displaced the thinking of millennial Zoomers and American youth is. Imagine it was Dick Cheney or W. Bush who had been treated the same way. But that would likely result in martial law and curfews in U.S. cities. Yeah, I think it is an interesting reaction. This apparent approval. I mean, basically approval of the killing of the United Healthcare CEO. So even though you have these people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren saying, well, of course, violence never solves anything, but then immediately they say, but there's a final breaking point. It is a kind of an, it's obviously a terrorist incident, but it's also a remarkably pointless incident, which may be why it's kind of enjoying a certain measure of approval, because how does killing the CEO of a health insurance company going to achieve anything. I mean, he will be replaced by somebody very much like he is. So it's a pointless act. I mean, you just, if you say, well, violence doesn't solve anything. Well, of course, violence can solve things if you have a targeted assassination, and therefore you can kill an important figure, a political leader in particular, and that could have a huge impact. And so, but that's a targeted assassination, because once you kill this leader, then there really isn't anyone who can take over, who's going to be as significant a figure. So, therefore, when Israel assassinates someone like Nasrallah, that has a certain amount of sense. I mean, I think Hezbollah clearly suffered a devastating blow by the assassination of Nasrallah. Now, obviously it's a terrible thing to do, but it made sense. Now, the killing of a United healthcare CEO just doesn't seem to do anything. I mean, it's a stupid act of violence. I mean, even the complaints people have about health insurance companies and all that they don't cover whatever, you pay all your premiums, and then they don't cover this or that, and so on. All of which are reasonable criticisms. But what has it got to do with the CEO? He's just a front man. I mean, he doesn't set policy. I mean, that's it's a long-standing policy of the health insurance companies. So, I mean, using that as in some ways there's a debate about health insurance. Well, there's no debate at all. I mean, there's a lot of people complaining, but it's not actually a debate about health insurance. So it's a pointless act of violence, and it hasn't generated any serious debate. So. All right. So that's right. But anyway, let me. Here we are. And then, and Marty says Hitchcock sabotage. That's a very good idea. Let me write that down. Hitchcock sabotage. I remember. Yeah, that's because apropos of the terrorist act. Yeah, Hitchcock sabotage. Yeah, very, very good suggestion. I saw it years ago. I don't remember it at all. I mean, some of those early Hitchcock films, I've seen all of them, Foreign Correspondent and so on. But I can't remember. Anyway, Judy, welcome, Judy. Always very good to see you. Thank you very much, as always, Judy, for your generosity. So Judy says, Trump today in Time magazine interview, I disagree very vehemently with sending missiles hundreds of miles into Russia. Yep, he said that. And then Mr. Trump told Time in an interview to Mark, being named the magazine's Person of the Year, saying Time, why are we doing that? We're just escalating this war and making it worse. That should not have been allowed to be done. That should not have been allowed to be done. He said that, and that was very good. But he also said something else. Because he was asked something like, "Are you going to abandon Ukraine?" And then he said, "Oh, abandonment. That's the worst thing we can do." I mean, something like that. I mean, in that interview. So he said, "No," or something like, "Abandonment. That's not the way to go." So he was not making clear that he's not going to abandon Ukraine. So yes, that's very good when he said sending missiles hundreds of miles into Russia. And let's hope that once he takes over, that whole policy is going to stop. But when he said something like, well, no, he suggested there was no way that the United States was going to abandon Ukraine. That kind of gave me pause. Why we're doing that? We're just escalating this war and making it worse. This should not have been allowed to be done. So anyway, I think, everything that you've just quoted there, Judy, is are very good things. again, I didn't like what he said about the abandon thing, which is somehow say we're going to stick with Ukraine, but you could read it in another way. The only question I have, and I said this really at the beginning, that will Trump really oppose everyone, the entire military, political, media establishment that will absolutely go crazy at the prospect of ceding territory to Russia, ceding territory to Putin, the man who likened to Hitler, and Trump's telling Ukraine, yeah, forget about NATO. I just have my doubts that that's going to happen, but we'll see. I mean, that those quotes are encouraging, but he has said other things that are not encouraging. So we'll see. Anyway, thank you so much, Judy. And then Anne Marie says Vanessa Beeley is saying in her UK column podcast that Putin hoisted the HDS flag on their embassy in Damascus. Isn't this a bit treacherous towards Assad, all the more as Putin is hosting him now in Russia? And how is that for Assad? Putin is thus paying seeming tribute to his adversaries. I don't know. I mean, I know that they hoisted the new Syrian flag on the Syrian embassy in Moscow. So, but I don't know. I mean, it sounds like this is the same thing, that they're hoisting this new Syrian flag on the Russian embassy in Damascus. So at least there's a certain consistency. I mean, it's kind of pathetic, to be honest. As I say, I mean, it's like, is it treacherous? Well, I don't know if it's treacherous. I think if you talk about treacherous, I think if that is the case, that Assad said, will you support the creation of a kind of a rump Syrian state in Latakia, which is the base of the Alawites and where your military base is, and the Russians said, no, we're not going to do that, and they just gave up completely. That I think is more disappointing than this. This is just simply accepting reality, that they basically know, hey, that government is gone, that Syria is gone. We're accepting the reality of who now runs Syria. I mean, the whole thing is really very depressing, and I can see Vanessa being very very upset by this. But I think Vanessa is going to be on the Gaggle very soon, so we'll definitely ask Vanessa about this. So anyway, look forward to Vanessa very shortly. Aristotle 1 says the American neocons want a war with Russia, so they're saying that Russia will attack Ukraine with Oreshniks when they really want Russia to attack a NATO country so that they can escalate and scupper any peace plan. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good analysis. I think that Russia absolutely resolutely refuses to be provoked, which has its advantages. Who the hell wants to be provoked into a world war? On the other hand, it has its disadvantages, which is if you don't do anything and you allow the Americans and the British to just attack your country, they get to attack your country, but you don't get to attack their country, then you're seen to be weak. And that only fuels further attacks on your country. So I agree that the American neocons, those who want a war with Russia, would love for Russia to attack NATO territory. And that's a danger. You could absolutely provoke a world war. On the other hand, if you don't, you're going to get a world war anyway, but a little bit down the road. But eventually, it's going to be a world war because you can't. Russia, whether led by Putin, led by anyone else, cannot accept Western countries just simply attacking it at will, while Russia itself does not attack the Western countries. I mean, you just can't. You cease to be a great power. You then become. You're reduced to the level of a Syria. You're a level of an Iraq or a Libya who gets bombed by the Western powers, but never gets to bomb the Western powers in turn because they just don't have the capability or the will to retaliate against the Western powers. So then Russia just ceases to be a great power. That's it. Russia is now on the level of an Iraq or a Vietnam. You get bombed, but you don't bomb yourself. So anyway, Anne-Marie says, yeah. Okay, so Anne-Marie says, sorry, I didn't say anything about the Pavan yet. I find it a very beautiful piece. The piano version, as well as the orchestra version, its sadness reminds me of that of Eric Satie. It's not a heavy, dramatic, and so to say, passionate and rebellious sadness, as for example in Sibelius's music, but rather a light and almost accepting deep melancholy, which is by no means their synthesis. That's really interesting. Yeah, I agree about Sibelius. I think that it's the sadness in Sibelius is, I think, more profound, and it is deeper than in Pavan. But Ravel, I think himself regarded the Pavan as being a youthful sketch. He said, okay, well, I wrote it as a young man, so he didn't really regard it as one of his great works. It's still very, very sad, but it's still he regarded as one of his early works. But it's a good point about Sibelius. Okay, all right. I think we're coming to the end of this live stream. So thank you, everybody who had joined me. Thank you for all of your really interesting and very thoughtful and challenging and stimulating questions. Thank you above all to those who contributed to the tip jar, because I think you understand the situation with the dogs and how hard my life is coping with them. So really appreciate that. So we're going to have some podcasts over the weekend, and I think you'll find them very interesting and enjoyable. And then Monday we'll we'll have the live stream with Peter, and then on Tuesday my live stream solo. In the meantime, please think about certainly ideas for future screenings, but the issue that raised by Marty about terrorism. So a collection of films that we can put up to a poll on films about terrorism. That would be really good, because Marty's point about Hitchcock's Sabotage is a really good suggestion. I think there are others. I don't know whether Under Western Eyes, the Conrad novel, has actually been made into a film, but if it has, that would be another possibility. So please, ideas for future screenings and ideas for the film poll about terrorism. And in the meantime, I'm going to have to deal with this issue of the subtitles, so which I haven't dealt with yet, but I will. Anyway, thank you very much for tonight, and remember, if you like the Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye-bye.